Well, this is Dan Cornett. He's a hell of a guy. There you go.
There you go. Works for me.
He was an Army bandmaster for a couple of centuries, and then he was the director of um, doctrine and training for all of Army Band. So if you think of how each division and each Army Band medium and large, like the even the West Point Band, how they go about doing their training and their day-to-day business. Well, that was all Stan's department, and I think he had a staff of what, about 10 or 12 there at Fort Story.
Yep, that's about right.
Yeah. And so each of those folks would kind of answer to him and his strong arm. But one of the biggest things that I saw while working for him is uh, he helped develop or redesign, I should say, how Army Band does their audition process. For the longest time, it was on a 4.0 scale, and no one ever made a 4.0. It was very subjective, somewhat arbitrary of how people were scored. And just about the time I left the Army, he and a lot of folks at the upper level brass were redesigning that so that there's an actual rubric for how folks are auditioned on every single instrument, and they mirror each other pretty closely, yet they are specific to the individual instruments that the Army has. Another fun task I got to do while working with Stan was we looked at how every single Army unit, what they call an IMTO, how many musicians they had on the books from the beginning of the Army until present day as of 2010 when I was doing that. And it was interesting how we were looking at, after each major conflict, there would be a drawdown, and you could see that represented in how many people were left in the Army Band afterwards. There was a time where almost every single company had a bugler and sometimes also a drummer attached to them. And we found some records to show how that kind of declined through the years. But that was just one thing I worked on. Stan has a huge wealth of knowledge in about every aspect of music that there is. So I'll just let him go through more of his background and what he can share with us being a community band. Stan?
Well, thanks, Tom. I appreciate those kind words. I'm not sure that I've got all that knowledge. I've probably forgotten a lot of it. So if it looks that way as we go along, just remember I'm old. Okay. It's what Tom said was true there. One of the big things that happened during that time I was at the Army School of Music was not just building that audition system from the bottom up, but we actually had to build curriculum from the bottom up. From about the end of World War II up until maybe in the 1950s, early 1950s, Army bands trained kind of on an ad hoc basis. There wasn't really a school that they attended. The band leaders attended schools right along through the first part of the 20th century and all that. But by the time we got hooked up with the Navy School of Music, there was a period of about 60 years there where all of our students, minus the bandmasters, took a Navy curriculum in music. And that curriculum was definitely a strong one. They built it in the 30s, and they built it on what was considered then to be sound principles of music education, all that sort of thing. But it didn't modernize very much over that 60 years. So when it came time to separate ourselves from the Navy's curriculum, not so much from their physical plant, but from their curriculum, we realized that we needed something like that. We needed a new audition system that focused more on what experts thought it took for an oboe player to score well, or for a drummer or a trumpet player. So that the graduated system of scoring that the Navy had really was built on a system that said, okay, everybody out there is subject to this 4.0 scale, 4.0 scale. And that scale of measurement should apply to the tuba as much as it does to the clarinet. Over a period of time, we all kind of had the feeling is that's really kind of crazy. I mean, when you look at the difference in the skills, the manual skills and some of the others that you need to play those instruments, it just didn't make sense at all. So we were building that at the same time we were trying to rebuild a curriculum for our new soldiers and for those who've been around for a while. It was a great exercise in the sense that we had a chance to literally build it from the ground up with the Navy sitting beside us. By the time we got done, they actually kind of liked a few of the things that we started doing. One of them was focusing on small groups rather than 60-piece bands or 40-piece bands or whatever, in an effort to build more individual musicianship and more individual musical leadership among some of our folks there. That worked out probably better than any of us ever expected, so much so that my counterpart in the Navy came to me after about a year or two of it and says, you know what, we kind of think that we want to do what you guys are doing. So they adopted some of the things that we had worked on and added some of their own thoughts, some of their own skills to it. And they're a bunch of truly excellent musicians over there. So they came up with some things that we hadn't thought of. And by the time we'd sort of mixed the chocolate and the peanut butter for a while, we ended up realizing that there was a lot more happening. Sailors were seeing performance opportunities that we didn't see, vice versa. So we were in a continual cycle there of doing some of that stuff. It included going to popular music trainers. There's a guy named Tom Jackson who lives in the Nashville area, who taught small groups and individuals to sing popular music, how to be present on stage, the kinds of things that should be done on stage, and trained our NCOs and some of our officers in how that worked. And eventually we started training even our brand new AIT students with that. So the upshot of it was that by the time we had things pretty much in place, there was a different kind of thing going on there. And my impression was that our NCOs in particular really liked it because it meant that they were actually leading their own small groups, anywhere from 3 to 8 or 10 people. It meant there was a wider variety of thought on what kind of literature should be played and how well and where it should go. So that whole experience was one that was really interesting to me. It took all my hair. I used to have a whole head of hair, but now it's gone just from that amount of work. But anyway, that's sort of what got me here in this conversation with you guys. I'll share one thing with you that I've always appreciated. During the years that I was working there and around when Tom was there, I was trying to assemble a picture for myself of what kinds of groups of professional musicians were at work in the country. And that led me to some organizations of community ensembles. And that became even more interesting because there are some organizations out there, as you know, for community ensembles, but there are also lots of those ensembles that aren't really affiliated. So there's sort of a mass of people who continue to play music after they've either slowed down their professional careers or maybe never had a professional career, maybe just wanted to keep up some of the skills they learned in high school and college, one thing or the other. But that effort led me to understand something that I've felt for a long time about any professional group, whether they're athletes or artists or anything else. And that is that the mass of people who continue playing their instruments in the ensembles like the one you have and some of the others are the actual base for whatever happens in the realm of music. Yeah, there are a lot of people out there who will tell you stories about growing up and teaching themselves to play, name an instrument, and they became very famous, one thing or the other. And the story sort of reads like I did it all on my own. Well, not really. uh, and the reason that there are so many musicians out there who do get those kind of opportunities, in my mind, is because exactly the thing that you're doing in the wind ensemble out there. People who continue to play and continue to work music, and the reasons have to be legion. I mean, it's not just that you love playing your instruments. There are probably a dozen other reasons for every person who continues playing. And I would certainly hope that you guys and all the other groups like yours cling to that a little bit and realize that what you're doing is actually laying the base, it's laying the foundation for interest in music anywhere in the country or anywhere around the world. I had the good fortune to live in Germany a couple of times as part of the military. And there I met quite a few folks who were doing sort of homespun community wind ensembles. They had all kinds of contests and one thing or the other. They're professional groups. I had a chance to meet a lot of them. And that pattern of interest in music and love of music growing out of that base of folks who may or may not be or have been professional musicians was just really interesting to me. So I say that hoping that every one of you is enjoying the experience you have with your wind ensemble there, and will continue to work with it. Where it goes and the kinds of things that may happen there, who knows? Those are all products of opportunities and leaders and followers and folks who just want to do some great things. But I applaud you for it. That's about that's about the basic load of what I came to the screen here with on my mind. Do you have any questions for me about any of the things that maybe Tom or I talked about?
Y'all can either unmute or ask the question in the chat, whichever works for you. They're shy.
Stan, one of the people that we brought in was Stan Freeze from Disney. Do you remember working with him?
I do.
Share a little bit about what he helped bring to the audition process for Army Band, but also maybe some of the other generals of what they look for in musicians. And I believe it was him that helped make the decision in changing the way we do the scoring for incoming audition versus the first, or that what they used to call F1. How there used to be an open gap, and sometimes the AIT students wouldn't bridge that gap between their audition and through basic training. In fact, it would either stay the same or get worse. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Among the great opportunities we had along those years came to some extent from Colonel Jim Keene, who's now the commander of the U.S. Army Band. What we wanted to do was find a way to get a more professional take on how we assessed musicians who wanted to come into the program and how we continued to assess them as they progressed through their careers. Stan Freeze was one of the first guys that we got in touch with. He, of course, used to be sort of Mr. Bandmaster at Disney out in California, ran all their parades and that sort of thing. Stan had so many years of hiring experience with musicians that he was able to tell us a couple of things that seemed sort of obvious after we heard them. Up to the time we met Stan, everything was focused on these numerical scoring systems, and they were based on some really weird thoughts about, so how well do I have to play this to increase by a point? Stan's basic question is, what do you mean points? Says you don't hire people by points to be musicians. Says you listen to them play and you make a general assessment of their excellence. You know, how much of it is there? How much can they do? I mean, do they seem to know all their scales? Can they improvise? Are they people who have good endurance and will perform, as well as spend some of their effort on connecting with people? Stan had lots of good suggestions for us in that business of connecting with people. And one of his thoughts was, what you select to play is critical. And to try to oversimplify it a little bit, if you're going out with a band someplace and you're playing what you like across a stage to a group of people who come, you're kind of throwing the dice on whether or not those people are going to follow you later on. Certainly you have friends and relatives, and they have friends and relatives who will come to hear you play. They love you, and that's fine. That's what makes part of this work. But for folks who are trying to figure out how to deal with assessing musicians, it wasn't working very well at all. So Stan kind of turned us on to the thought that we need to spend some time thinking about, what do our groups do? Who are the people they see? I mean, obviously they see soldiers and military people on a frequent basis, but they also spend a fair amount of time in the civilian communities. So that meant spending some time trying to understand what kinds of music do people want to hear on any kind of a basis, whether it's a concert or a job on a street corner or whatever may be going on out there. And that led us to look into some of the studies on how people form their musical preferences. That information informed what we were telling instructors at the time about selecting literature, that as they are teaching people how better to play their instruments, part of what they need to be doing is talking to those individuals about the kinds of music that they know folks are going to want to play or folks are going to want to hear. So it means that if you're a classical musician or if you're a pop musician or one thing or the other, and you've got your head kind of stuck in that groove, it means you need to figure out how to put your head in different grooves at different times and play credibly well for those audiences. Tom Jackson came into the fray at that time. He introduced us to a guy named Randy Jackson. He's a guitar player for Whitesnake down in Louisiana. Randy is a schooled musician. You know, he's been through all the music education stuff, and he can play his instrument backwards and forwards. He's a great singer. Just as an example of one of the things that he gave us, we asked Randy, says, Randy, do guitar players or singers really need to read music? I mean, what do they need to read? He scratched his chin for a while, looked back at us, and he says, well, why do you want them to read? So, of course, on our side of that question, nobody had ever really thought that through. Do you really want a singer to stand up in front of a group of people with a music stand and sing popular music or anything else? Maybe some do, but probably not. Same thing for guitar players. Their lives aren't built around their reading skills, although many of them are fantastic readers. Their skills are built around conveying some sort of, whether it's popular music, jazz, you name the style, that's where they make their bones, is by convincing people through the quality of what they do that they're actually communicating with them. So that was a big question for assessing people. The thing that I think helped us most is we had a keyboard instructor with us at the time down there at the school who basically had this insight that said, look, people don't like taking tests where there is no top score to be made. It just doesn't make sense that no matter what you do, no matter who you are, how well you play or sing, you're never going to be able to reach the top. At that time, the Navy's philosophy was, well, the top would be perfection. And of course, we know there is no such thing as a person who can play at a perfect level. So they adjusted their scores to reflect that philosophy. We did the exact opposite. We built a 40-point scale. It says, okay, if you have to have numbers, here's 40 of them. And we're going to gradate them a little bit along the way here. But the idea being that it's entirely possible that a really skilled player can play 40 or better than 40. And we'll acknowledge that skill and try to reward this individual in some career enhancing way for being able to do that. So that's still going on there now. The small group effort was one that was really rewarding, I think, to the NCOs in the sense that most of the non-commissioned officers in the Army Bands program understood that when they went to a unit in the field, they weren't going to have that templated mix of musicians that came out in their authorizations. If the authorizations said they were going to have 6 trumpet players and 4 of these and 2 of those and whatever, the odds were they might have anywhere from 2 to 12 trumpet players and 1 flute and some really strange mix of woodwind instruments in the group. That kind of meant that they had to have a way of thinking about, so how do I do jobs with people who are playing all these different instruments, and all the music in our library is written for a band or for a stage band or something with a very stereotypical instrumentation. So, of course, I mean, the answer was pretty obvious. Well, that means you need to get really good at substituting instruments. You need to spend a good bit of time on finding arrangements, doing arrangements for odd groups of instruments, and trying to pick music that's going to be appealing in one way or another to whatever audiences you find out there.
Stan?
Yes.
So just a little bit more detail on that. At TRADOC, before I went to the warrant side, we had a really awesome arranger named Master Sergeant Dale McGivney. And how he approached what Stan was talking about was he would take a lot of these woodwind, brass quintet, other ensemble type music, and he would just break them down into part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, all the way down to part 6. And each part was written in every clef. So part 1 would be about 10 pages long, but it was that part in every single clef that could be that we see in the score. So you could take any hodgepodge of instrumentation and make a group. And why that became so important for us is because the time period that Stan was talking about was, you had many of the division bands who were out in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also filling in for other places where, say, I don't know, one time when I was at AMC, the West Point band was somewhere else, so we had to go up and do a 5-star funeral, and we had to take these McGivney arrangements, Master McGivney's arrangements, and use what we had left over that wasn't deployed somewhere around the world, and it was very helpful. But it was a new way of thinking, so much that I know I won't call her out by name, but there was a Chief Warrant Officer 5 she had been in the Army band so long that this was such a new thing to her that she almost couldn't wrap her head around it. And when she retired, she would still call it, our motley crew. I mean, it was just really difficult for her to adapt to a changing Army band. Sorry, Stan.
No problem. Yeah, that was in that discussion there of what Master Sergeant McGivney did was crucial. One of his insights was there's a whole bunch of music that not just military musicians, but everybody wants to play for people. Happy birthday. I mean, there are all kinds of celebratory music. Some of it's kind of mundane, but some of it's kind of expected. If you have that music written only in the scoring for a band or a brass choir or something like that, then you're limited to the idea that, that's what has to happen. So a lot of what we were trying to get done was encourage the non-commissioned officers out there in the field and the officers to take these small groups of people and figure out ways to score things in some sort of universal scoring, so that all these really common tunes that are asked for in lots of different situations could be played by nearly anybody. One of the folks here, Tom and Ellen, asked about a little bit of background and context regarding the path and duties of a military musician. And their context is they're wanting to understand why these gradings are important to them. When I came in the Army, and I'm sure Tom remembers some of these days too, the numbers of people in Army bands who could really play well on demand was not that great. You could go from band to band, and band A in this particular location might be doing really well. Band B with the exact same instrumentation would not be doing well at all. Some of that had to do with leadership. I mean, leaders who insisted on getting higher quality performance from their instrumentalists. Some of it just had to do with the number of other things than music that soldiers were being asked to do. But it was a general consensus among those of us who visited bands and did what we used to call technical inspections, that there were lots of bands out there that just really did not play well at all. It wasn't because all the players were bad. It's because there were enough unskilled players to sort of drag down the level of the group when they went out there. For many years, we banged our heads on walls trying to figure out, well, how do we fix this? Some of it, or a large part of it, was just in recruiting. Right around the beginning of the Operation Iraqi Freedom over there, after the 9/11 bit going on over there, we had an opportunity to get college loan repayment for our musicians. And we went into that specifically so we could screen out players who were beginners or maybe intermediate level players who really didn't have the understanding and the skill to be able to take a pouch of music or even just improvised stuff and go anywhere and do just about anything at a high level. So we had 2 or 3 years there where we were getting PhD music students, ABD music students, had lots of master's degree educated musicians in there who were just kind of rolling into the Army during that time, partly because of what happened in 9/11 and in large part because of that college loan repayment program. So over a period of years up to about from 9/11 up to about 2006 was a building period. Everybody was getting highly skilled players. So we knew that we needed to look at the audition differently. Since we weren't going to accept people who could not play at just a reasonably professional level, that meant that we had to look at those who could and find ways to make the audition more challenging, which would tell us a lot more about what they could do once they went to the field. So that whole business of the audition was a key element of supporting that particular action to bring higher skilled musicians into our programs so that any group anywhere could do very credible music. And it does that now. These days, it's hard to find an Army band, whether they're on a division post or at Fort Myer or there with the Army band. It's hard to find one of them that is a bad band. Most all of them play extremely well. Now, you can tire them out. You can give them a bunch of extra duties that have nothing to do with music and task them to do one thing or the other and wear them out to the point that they haven't played in a while. And it's going to take them a few hours or a couple of days to get chops back up and work again. But there were times when that just wasn't possible. So that's probably the major portion of it. When we hire one of those musicians and they come to the Army School of Music, one of the things we're trying to figure out there is, so what things can these soldiers do other than whatever their primary instrumental or vocal skills might be? We want to see them try, at least if they haven't done it before, to play popular music, to do soul, to play jazz, to play Dixieland, to do any number of styles, and get an idea of how they're going to react to it. The non-commissioned officers who teach there at the school pretty much run those little ensembles. So they're getting not just the idea of what this or that individual soldier can do, they're getting ideas on just how far you can expand the performance range of any given instrumentalist. What we learned was that there were lots of the highly skilled musicians who had no qualm at all about picking up another instrument, singing, doing any number of things that contributed to the effort. Most of them seemed to be pretty pumped up about the idea of not just picking up another instrument, but if they didn't already improvise, to meet some of the instructors there at the school who could teach them that. That's important. When you're in some of the situations that Army bands found themselves in, like in Southwest Asia, Europe, Japan, Korea, it's not uncommon to be in a situation where somebody asks for a piece of music that we all know the title and that rings a bell, but can you put 5 or 6 people together to play it credibly? We got to a point where that was more often the case than not that we could do that. Folks just didn't, folks who played at the level and who understood music at the levels that are out there now just didn't blink an eye. I can remember when it was extremely rare to find musicians who could and would transpose at sight, or if they couldn't transpose at sight, if you gave them a couple hours with their part, they could come back and play it transposed. That was a rare skill, not so much anymore. So that's part of what this is all about, is trying to cultivate among musicians the notion that, yes, there are such things as bands and there's band music and you've got to be able to play that. That's true. But there's a lot of other things that we've ignored because in the past, some of our leaders have had a fairly stereotypical view of, the 50-piece band that plays, Granger and all these other things and nothing but that, because their view was that's what that instrumentation was for. It was to do just that kind of music. A lot of folks that I know looked at it and said, well, who said? If you can do other kinds of music, why wouldn't you? That kind of diffused its way out there and became more of a concern for a lot of people. As that brand new musician goes out to the field and he serves in a band for 3 or 4 years, every one of them who stays in the Army is going to come back to the School of Music first for a kind of basic leadership course for sergeants there at the school. They'll go back out again for 2 or 3 tours with bands. They'll come back again for a senior level leadership course among musicians. Those 2 courses include a lot of information on how the Army works and what Army policies they need to know about and discipline and a number of other things. But they also include a lot of this work with small groups, a lot of work with figuring out how do we make a really weird mix of instruments appealing to people. So that's gone on there. Somewhere in between that basic and senior non-commissioned officer course, there's been a thought before when I left, at least by the time I left there, that we ought to be talking to each other more about singing, whether it's singing background, singing lead, one thing or the other, because there's a bleed over effect in the musicianship required of singing and that required of playing instruments. How many times have you heard a conductor say, play this like you're singing? Well, that's kind of what it's about. Music without words, music without people singing words can convey messages, and it can affect our emotions just like a vocalist can. But there's just something about that human being looking at you with their two eyes at your face and singing a piece of music. It just makes a difference. I don't know what the difference is. I don't know how big the difference is, but it makes a difference. Warwick asks, what's a typical performance schedule for a military band pre-COVID? There are a lot of ways to answer that question, but a typical performance schedule, if they're on a division post or a corps post in the CONUS, means that they're going to be playing lots of change of command ceremonies. Change of command season in the Army is basically from like beginning of summer to into the early fall. So the hot months of the year in a lot of places. Changes of command are done in marching bands, and there's lots of conventional marches, and the people who are being honored at these ceremonies ask for weird pieces of music to be played for them. I'll never forget the guy who actually asked, y'all know how'd that go? It says, you stomped on my heart and mashed that sucker flat. And there really was a country tune by that name. So we were out looking around for whatever that was to see if we could make this guy happy. But the change of command season is sort of the Army music program doing its conventional thing, marching in rows and columns and trying to entertain people along the way. A lot of the young bandmasters have adopted some of the corps style marching techniques, and there are various other things that they've tried. Outside of that conventional kind of stuff, the small groups inside Army bands will often be tasked to do community support kinds of jobs. And I don't mean just civilian community, I mean even the military community. There's some kind of celebration going on, or there's a holiday event, a 4th of July event, or some other kind of event that has a military tag to it. So those smaller groups now are going out more often to perform for those groups of people. I wish I had some of the recordings that I had with me there at the School of Music. Some of those 5 and 6 piece groups absolutely would bowl you over with the kind of thing they could do. I don't mean volume. I mean, they had extremely high musician skills and could, milk the tear out of people who are there on the scene with them and get that emotional effect that we were looking for. The popular music groups in the Army bands, they got to the point that they were almost scary for the kinds of things they could do. If you could find anything on pop music out there on the web someplace, somewhere in the Army, there are 4 or 5 groups that could do that, even to some of the extreme heavy metal death. I don't know all the names of the styles, but they could do it. And those same musicians would put those instruments down and sit down then and do chamber music for some kind of a reception, that kind of a small atmosphere where quiet music that invoked relaxation, something that's done just below the level of conversation to kind of support the socialization. The net result is having a group that can do a much wider variety of things than maybe they had been able to do in the past. For the musicians who stay in the program, their destiny is going to those 2 senior leadership courses, but they also have opportunities to apply for being a warrant officer bandmaster. That involves a different kind of selection. There's some leadership skills that have to be assessed. They assess their just broader knowledge of music and how it fits together, how to put ensembles together and get products, meaning what kinds of shows, what kinds of presentations need to be done. So that's kind of what the the whole schedule is like. And I should say also that what I just described to you is sort of a simplified, rounded off version of that schedule. If you're in a military band someplace, you could be called to take 60 people, 3 people, or 10 or 15 people to some of the strangest kinds of things you've ever seen, and some of the most wonderful you've ever seen. I've told everybody I ever met when I was in the Army music program, if you get a chance, you take an assignment in Europe, in Germany. You're going to see audiences there that you will not see here in the United States. And Germany is just sort of it's sort of a heuristic for a lot of Europe. There's a lot of Europe where you can go to most any town and take just about any kind of group you can think of to a street corner or to a city plots and play anything, and people like it. They'll stop what they're doing and they'll come gather around and listen to what you're doing, and they'll have opinions about it, and they'll sing with you and play with you or whatever it is that's going on there. But the attitude that most Europeans have toward music, it's just not the same as it is in the United States. And for any musician to get that experience of finding crowds who don't have to be drugged to a location to hear a performance, that's something that's worth having. It's worth understanding that whatever you've experienced so far, there are parts of the world that are going to take that experience and sort of expand it to something that you may never have expected. See, somebody mentioned 6-string soldiers. Those guys are really amazing. They started out at the field bands kind of an accident. They ended up playing someplace during the winter. 6 of them got together with their stringed instruments and somebody recorded, and they sang and played some things in snowbanks and in a winter setting. A lot of military officers and NCOs thought that was just great because they were doing country music, folk music, some kinds of things that you just wouldn't expect. They've developed now into being able to do all of that to attract professional Irish music groups from Ireland to perform with them on the web or even in person. So those guys really hit a chord, and it seems like they're going to be going strong for a while now. See, are the duties of bands for each of the branches of the armed services relatively similar? Yeah, in a really broad sense, they are relatively similar. Each of the services does ceremonies like changes of command, and there are a few other types of ceremonies that they do. Each service has their own take on how those ceremonies work. The Navy has an approach to ceremonies that doesn't often use lots of sailors and people, in squads and columns marching around, that kind of thing. They typically like to do shipboard kinds of ceremonies that focus on bringing an audience in, but doing some routine things that are not quite as active, let's say, as you might find in the Army and Marine Corps. The Air Force, as you know, at the end of World War II, when the Air Force was established, they experimented a little while with taking the same training the Army was getting, which was pretty abysmal at that time. They basically said, no, we don't need that. They just started out hiring musicians at a much higher level than anybody else was at that time, and not training them at all in a formal school sense. They had them do degree completions and other kinds of musical training that brought them to the high quality kinds of performances that they can do now. I think that all the services in the period from 9/11 up to now have had different kinds of growth. The growth may not be in the numbers of people that they have, but the growth is in the quality of people that they have performing with them. So that when they think of some creative bit that they would like to play, they can do that knowing that among the 4 or 5 people they're dealing with there, 2 or 3 of them are fully capable of writing or at least sketching out or doing Nashville notation or whatever it is that it takes to make those performances come alive.
There's a serious question for you, Stan.
Okay.
I just maybe go into the thinking behind why we did that at that time.
Why we did
the mime training. When I was going through warrant school, they brought in mimes to teach the warrant officers and officers.
Yeah, that did happen. I remember that now. The idea came actually from academia, was that conductors are trying to communicate with musicians without words, obviously. So maybe the idea, maybe if they taught these would-be conductors the skills of a mime, they would be more expressive on the podium. Well, I don't know if that ever helped anybody or not, whether it was the conductor or the musicians, but it was a, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say so. It was a serious question. I think it's kind of fun to talk about. So we spent an entire week of that, not just a day or two or even a few hours. It was 5 days, 8-hour days with a quick lunch break. And we went through everything mimes go through in their warm-ups, their whole body expressions. They one of the ones I remember clearly is it was called, I think, was it 28 or 40 or 50 positions? You had to, they would say one, and you had to find a position for your body and hold it for a while. But you had to, this is harder than you think, to find 50 positions to move your body and just hold it there. Their overall objective was, I think, very smart. And if I were a teacher of conductors at the time, or right now, I would try to do the same. And Stan was right there. We are trying, mimes will tell you an entire story with very few motions. And up on the podium, we are trying to convey a laundry list of emotions to each section with just a nod, a wink, a gesture. And you have an entire piece to get through with all of these interacting emotions. Or if you want to phrase it differently, all these different lines from the different sections. And sometimes, even in the same section, you take a horn section, if they have split parts, then you might have different emotions coming together, different lines that are playing with each other. And that mime training was very interesting. So I would think that, it was very productive and very helpful, at least to me. I don't know about the other people in my class. I think when we first started, the first half a day, we were like, okay, is this bullshit over yet? But by the end of the week, it was like, okay, I can now be a little bit more expressive than maybe I was before. But that was one of those, new wave kind of thinkings that was going on about, I don't know, that thought process probably started 2005, 6 or 7. By the time it came to fruition, it was about 9 or 10. And that's when I was going through the warrant course.
Yeah. And it's not the only effort similar to that. There was a period of time where some of the conservatories and some of the major music schools were looking at things like Tai Chi. There were other disciplines that required very controlled and very focused types of movement for a lot of different reasons. But there was a hope that kind of training would help newer conductors feel more confident about what they were going to do with their hands or the baton or whatever. And I, like the mime thing, I would not be surprised at all if we couldn't find, a number of folks who had some of these kinds of Alexander technique, the Tai Chi and others that they will tell you helped them in one way or the other with what they were doing as conductors or even as players and singers. I've talked to a number of singers who, when you mentioned Alexander technique, they go, oh, yeah, right, we've all done that. So those things aren't just, kind of free floating out there in the sense that nobody has a grasp on them. One thing that I've observed about conductors, I started doing this with some folks I knew when I went to the Army School of Music as a lieutenant. We were all conducting rehearsal bands. They were like Groundhog Day. You get the conductor du jour in there, and we each had a folder with music in it. We tried to turn the music over every once in a while, but from the player's standpoint, it was basically the same thing, 3 hours a day, every day of the week. Play this, play that, play the other thing. Play this, play that, play the other thing. And of course, by the time they'd been there for 6 months, their heads were fried with all that because it was a lot of rehearsal for no performance, which is another one of the things we tried to change curriculum-wise there when we had our rebuild, was to stop doing that, to have shorter doses of that rehearsal band kind of thing. But if we did have a leader rehearse a group for something, it had to be with the idea that there was a performance of some kind at the other end of it. That helped a little bit. But during that time when we were doing Groundhog Day and rehearsal bands, there were 3 or 4 of us there who got kind of interested in Seiji Ozawa's work with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So we started watching his videos, and then that became watching videos of nearly anybody else we could find who really had high levels of skill standing in front of a group. After we'd done that for a couple of years, we'd sort of sit in a little group of 4 or 5 people and kind of, critique what we were seeing, I guess is the word. But finally, I looked at the other guys and said, we've seen, name a number, 20 of these high-level orchestral conductors. Not one of them looks like the other. They don't. So the canon of conducting that you get in college, you learn beat patterns and how to do the caesura and all the other kinds of things. You learn lots of individual little pieces of what goes on there. But when it gets to the business of communicating to a bunch of people who are extremely talented, skilled musicians out there, it's just a different game. We tried for a while to see if we could figure out, so what are the patterns in that? Is there some kind of rudimentary base that goes into it? And I don't think we ever got anywhere with it. Basically, what I think it amounts to is, I heard one of our current or former Army bands officers say that he doesn't really think that it has anything to do with teaching people to be conductors, that there's not an actual curriculum for that. There's probably a curriculum for being a director, learning the parts and pieces of how music fits together, how to train people to play it, that kind of thing. But being a conductor who can stand up in front of that same group of people and not just get the group to play together, but get the group to bring the musical thought, or to bring the actual emotional content out of the music, that's when we're talking about a conductor. And for the guys that I particularly appreciated, and many of the women that are out there conducting now, they all seem to come from a different place, but at the end of the performance, they've done some pretty amazing things. I just watched a video of Dudamel doing Barber's Adagio for strings. It's the first time I've ever seen the guy conduct when he didn't look like he was on dope. But he was absolutely magnificent with that. Now, why is that? I'm just at a loss. I like to kid the other guys I know who are still out there working this is, listen, conducting is a dark art. It's dark because nobody can explain why it works, and very few can explain even how it works, but they can stand up in front of a group and do it. So there's some kind of mystery there that I'm pretty sure I'm never going to solve. Maybe some of you guys will be able to do that soon. I saw a question down there. Somebody asked, Warwick Wilson asked, reading there's music created and arranged by military bands available for download. I think there probably is. The last time I remember reading about it was the U.S. Army Band at Fort Myer, and I think the Field Band had some downloadables. Both of those groups had downloadable clinics on different instruments, sort of podcast style. And the ones I saw I thought were very credible, really, really good kinds of stuff going on there. I would tell you this though, during the time I was there at the School of Music, one thing that became a huge issue was copyright. So military bands in the past had been in the habit of somebody wakes up and says, hey, I could do an arrangement of name some great tune. And they would do the arrangement, put it out there, and they'd share it with the other bands, and it would go places where it probably shouldn't have gone. And it didn't occur to anybody that they were violating copyright laws. Over time, the Army as a whole got sensitive to that because the Army War College, some of the higher level military schools wanted to use materials that were protected by copyright. So over a period of time, lots of places in the Army started training people in copyright law and what can and cannot be shared. So if you're interested in knowing what's available, there's two routes I would suggest you take. If there is a military band anywhere near you and you know somebody in that band, try to find out who's doing the arranging and just talk to them about what's actually possible. You can also talk to, online, that's what I'm thinking about, some of the folks there at the Army Band and the Field Band and at the School of Music. And there are people there who are very willing to share with you, whatever the state of the art is. But I mean, it's true. There are some really good arrangements of things out there. Some that are what I would call not like high art, but just very effective, well arranged. They get done what the tune is supposed to get done and all that. So anyway, bottom line, I would suggest talk to the people at the Army School of Music, the Army Band, the Army Field Band, and just ask them what's out there and what you can download for free. Arrangers and composers in the military, are the arrangers trained by the Army, or are they recruited, or both? Some of both. There used to be some formal training for leaders in Army music to do arrangements. For instance, there used to be a standard thing that in the Warrant Officer Bandmaster course, they had to write an original march that was scored or graded, by their mentor there, and it had to be usable. I visited Kneller Hall in England, the British Army School of Music. They not only had to write marches, of course, they have state religion there. They had to write religious music. They had to be able to write a mass for the Church of England. There are 2 or 3 other things that they were tested on to do that. I think right now the British Army's School of Music, maybe the Australian, there are only a few of them I know of that still have a curriculum that requires that kind of composition and arrangement. The actual training they get is from people who are already doing it well. I doubt that you could find somebody who's getting sort of the Arranging 101 book like you might get in a 2nd or 3rd year college program. Typically what happens is people who want to do composition and want to do arranging can find each other. And these days with technology, it's easier for them to find each other and say, hey man, listen to this, what I wrote. Tell me what you think about it. And they'll trade things like that. One that I know in the San Antonio area, a retired warrant officer named Charles Booker, from the time he got in the military, he was already an arranger and a very good one. But like anybody else who's good at their craft, he read all the books. He read Stan Kenton's stuff and Henry Mancini, looked at the charts and, dissected them and did all the things that it takes to understand how to make certain kinds of sounds happen. So that's pretty much how it works in the military, is that arrangers and composers come to us with a background already in place, and then work through what's needed in their groups or what they think they would like to do, and let that give them the experience to improve themselves. Back to the music selection for the audience, music that's most important to age groups and by what was popular, during specific age ranges. There's actually some research on this. Daniel Levington mentions this, and I think Oliver Sacks mentioned it too. Right now I'm drawing a blank on where that original research was done, but through a lot of surveys and a lot of interviewers, the original research was based on looking at the age ranges at which people begin to solidify their preferences in music. And in a very rough capsule, it comes out kind of like this. By the time we hit the age range of something like 11 or 12 to 14 or 16, that appears to be the period of time where we're kind of gobbling in lots of different types and styles of music. A lot of it's mediated by what our friends are listening to. And a lot of it has to do with just the way we like to dance or not dance or listen or whatever. From 16 to about 18 or 21, somewhere in that age range, that's where most people begin to kind of gel their preferences around certain kinds of styles that they like to hear. Now, we're talking about people who are not studying music. These are just the folks who are consuming music for their own reasons, whatever they are. From 21 to about 34, so 35, somewhere in there, that gelling of preferred styles kind of becomes even a little harder and more defined yet. There are still people in that age range, though, who will find contemporary kinds of music that maybe they've never heard before and sort of accept that into their lexicon of preferred music. I think the original research said that somewhere around the age of 40 to 45, you're pretty much locked in unless you're an aficionado. You're somebody who just seeks out different kinds of music and is willing to bring it in there. So by the time you hit 45 to 50, you could pretty much sit down with a piece of paper and write a list of maybe 10 styles of music or 5 or 6 styles of music that you really like. So what that meant for people who are out there performing is that if I wanted to tailor my selections of music to what people want to hear, I would first take a look at who seems to be coming to the performances that I'm giving and try to make a rough estimate of what their age range is. Do they seem to be in their 40s or their 70s or 30s or whatever it is? Then calculate the dates backward to whatever year they were about 16 years old. Then go to Rolling Stone, go to any of the magazines that are keeping track of the charts of popular music. And if you look at their top 20 for any given year in that 12 to 16 year time frame, you'll have a pretty fair idea of the kind of popular music that they're going to want to hear. The kind of thing that still makes them remember the high school prom and how they met Freddie or Betty or whoever they ended up feeling close to. So that's a way of figuring out how you're going to do this. We found a couple of interesting things with that too. There's a there are stories among military bands about the general who comes up to the stage and plays drums because that's what he did in high school, or played trumpet or guitar. And it was usually playing marches and that kind of stuff. By the time I left the School of Music, there were 2- and 3-star generals who were picking up guitars and keyboard in rock and roll bands and performing with the bands on their base. So that was telling you something about that progression, through the ages. These were guys who, when they were in their teens, were doing garage bands of one kind or the other and still wanted to do it as they were approaching the senior parts of some other career. So that's a little framework that you can kind of think through. I believe Daniel Levington probably had the best explanation of it. And for the life of me, I can't think of the name of his book that explained that. Daniel Levington was a performing musician. I think he played bass guitar and guitar, did that for a lot of years, became a music producer, got into cognitive science, and now he's got a PhD in cognitive science that he applies to musical topics fairly often. He and Oliver Sacks, there are 2 or 3 other big name academics who have gotten into that and done some work on how to explain what people get from music. Oliver Sacks did a lot of work on explaining to us, from looking at functional magnetic resonance imaging of people listening to music, how that kind of thing affects the brain, and how the brain deals with our moods and the way we think about things. There's some pretty interesting stuff in there. Yeah, your brain on music. Exactly. I think the big takeaway there is that if what you're interested in is ensuring that all of the music you perform or some of the music you perform can touch the lives of people that you frequently see, or age groups that you frequently see at your performances, that's one way of doing some fairly simple math, doing a little bit of research in the top 40 charts all the way back into the 1940s, and getting an idea of what kinds of tunes would give them that warm fuzzy at the next performance you do. The people I know who've tried that will say, yeah, that works. I don't think they're really into a lot of the science of it, but I think the folks that I know who've tried it like the idea of having a greater likelihood of finding those tunes that tug the emotional strings of people in their audience. Yeah, this is your brain on music. Daniel Levington, fine writer. He and there was another guy took issue with one of my heroes. I don't know if you know who Steven Pinker is. Steven Pinker started out as a linguist, became a cognitive science. He's the chair of some department at Harvard now, I think. But he wrote a lot about evolution and adaptivity. What kinds of things made us as humans survive. And he came to a point where he made a statement in one of his books that he figured that music was actually sort of auditory cheesecake, that it didn't really help us survive. It didn't help spread the genes and all that kind of thing. Well, there were a lot of folks in the community of academic musicians. Oh, that can't possibly be right. You're wrong, Pinker. That's just stupid. It turns out that Pinker is actually a musician himself. During the times he was at MIT and Harvard, he played in little faculty garage band kind of groups and sang and that sort of thing. So unlike what a lot of his detractors had to say, that he just didn't care anything about music, that really wasn't the point at all. All he was telling people was, with the evidence I've seen, I can't find anything that tells me that music somehow continues to procreate our race. Others will say, well, music, it gets people to dance and makes them socialize, and that increases the odds of people procreating and having more children. Well, yeah, I guess that's true. But to say that that's adaptive for human beings as a whole, I'm kind of like Pinker. I'm not ready to make that jump yet. But to me, it's just kind of emblematic of how far we've come in what we know about how the arts inform the sciences and vice versa, and just what it is we're doing when we consume music and for what reasons. Um, I'm sure you know, and I know people who consume music for none of the reasons that have to do with dancing and socializing. They just assume be in a room, like the old Bose speaker advertisement shows the speakers blowing a guy's hair back sitting in a chair. Uh, there are folks who just absolutely must have the meditative kind of relief they get from music. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Later on, I was talking to some of my friends about Pinker's statement about the auditory cheesecake and how it's not adaptive. And I finally just realized, so what? I mean, from the time people started making tunes on flutes made of bird bones, music has just continued and hasn't stopped. I mean, yeah, you can suppress it here and suppress it there, I suppose, for political reasons. But whether it's adaptive or not, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere over, thousands, maybe millions of years. And that's finally where I left that topic. Was I don't even care if it's adaptive. As long as people are still doing it and still enjoying it, and still communicating with it, I'm good.
Just stand back up there a ways. Bob was wanting to know, what was your path to becoming an Army band leader, and are you involved in community bands now?
Mine was kind of an accidental path. When I came into the Army as a lieutenant, I was branched infantry. I'd been branched infantry during the last years of the Vietnam War. And when it came time to getting time to graduate and that sort of thing, there were about 12 of us in my class who were branched infantry. And one day somebody came in there in 1972, I think it was, and said, "Oh, Nixon's bringing everybody home. There's not going to be any more Vietnam." All 12 of us looked at each other and had the same thought at the same moment. Dodged a bullet. Really dodged a bullet. So I went into the Army and did a year as a basic training officer, branched infantry. And while I was there, a friend of mine named Finley Hamilton called me and says, "Hey, I've got this job here at the School of Music as their director of training. So I'm going to get out of the Army for a while. He had a number of things he had to resolve. Says, why don't you come up here and audition for that?" I said, "Man, I don't know. I haven't conducted anything. I haven't done anything in years." So I thought, well, what the heck? So I got in my car and drove to Virginia Beach and took the audition. And the lieutenant colonel who was there says, "Okay, we'll bring you in. Says, we'll get you out of your commitment to quartermaster branch and bring in." And I said, "I don't think you can do that." He says, "Yeah, we can. We do this all the time." So I went back to Fort Jackson, stayed there for a month. Okay, that's the last I'm going to hear of that. Then I get a call from a guy at Department of the Army who says, "Is this Lieutenant Cornett?" "Yes, it's me." He says, "Well, I need you to be ready to move to Virginia Beach in about another 3 months." Dead silence. I said, "Okay." So that was quite literally how I got into it. I went to the School of Music and took the job as director of training that Finley Hamilton left. Finley Hamilton came back into the Army, had a wonderfully successful career, retired as a full colonel. There's even an award, the Colonel Finley R. Hamilton Award for Musical Excellence, that's given annually to military musicians. So he did very well. But that's how I got into it. The first few years, I was there at the School of Music for a couple of years and went to Germany. There I did a staff job as a bands officer. There were 8 bands in Germany at the time, and my job was to inspect each one of them annually and to work on whatever staff and logistics issues they needed solved. The people I worked for at the time says, "Well, that's not much of a job." Says, we want you to work in plans and operations too." So, okay. So did that for 3 years. Came back and went to, where did I go? After I left Germany on that tour, I came back to the States and went to the Defense Information School, which was then at Fort Ben Harrison, Indianapolis. So I took that course. I took the AG Captain's Career course while I was there. That was about 3 months of training jammed into 8. So that kind of got me to the next assignment where I was XO at the Army Field Band for a couple of years. Then I went to another staff job as the DA staff bands officer, did a couple of other things, but that was sort of the path. For me, I got to the field band. By that time, I'd done a lot of this rehearsal conducting stuff at the school and enjoyed that. When I got to the field band, at that time, their modus operandi was to put together 3 basic programs that they could do each evening when they were on tours. And they would rotate those programs, throughout the week. One of the programs was a fairly short one for weekends and had a group that would do high schools. What I found out was going literally every night to another hotel, sleeping there, getting up, eating, doing another performance, go to another hotel, repeat as needed. After about 6 weeks of that, I was just ready to go jump off a bridge someplace. It just drove me crazy. Plus, what I found out too was that, and I'm just speaking for myself, I did not like having that set rotation of tunes to stand up and conduct every night. Same thing all the time. It was sort of like my Groundhog Day. So after a couple of years of that, I decided, no, I kind of not into that. I then went to Germany again, where I was commander of the U.S. Army Europe Band and Chorus, and I really enjoyed that. We didn't do those long, extended 6-week tours. We did shorter visits throughout Germany, but we literally traveled from Italy to Sweden in the course of doing events of one kind or the other. Usually they were tattoos. Sometimes they were concert performances. Sometimes they were just routine sorts of music in a square kind of a thing. But that was where I had an opportunity to meet a lot of European folks in the context of musical kinds of performances, and got sort of the idea that they looked at music much like we look at having bread at a meal. You just don't do it. You don't go without it if you're doing something that calls for it. So that's kind of what took me into the Army as a musician and doing a few other things. What are some of the lessons rebuilding the Army band program that can directly apply to a community band? There probably are some. In the Army, we have bands in the National Guard and in the reserves, and they typically perform during drill periods. Some of those bands get together for like a weekend a month. Some of those bands spread out the number of hours that they're paid to train over a month, so that they've got rehearsals once a week. So they've got sort of a broken up schedule there for training that may kind of reflect some of the practices in the civic bands. I think one thing that's very common is that in those reserve component bands, they really do have to think about who their audience is. They live with the people that they see most often in their performances. So obviously there's a motivation there to not disappoint them, as well as to give the best account of themselves that they can. And they've been subject to a lot of the same influences that musicians have everywhere. They have some leaders who've got a very narrow stereotyped view of what their group should do. They have some leaders who've got a much broader idea to include more different things. And in the reserve components, they have a little bit more latitude in hiring people for specific skills. They have ways of kind of masking exactly what it is that individual is doing. But the point is that if they want to have a credible country music group, they can build one and keep it for years and years and years. In the active Army, if we build one at Fort Hood, we can keep it together for 2-3 years at the most. Then those soldiers get reassigned other places, and that particular group just kind of goes up as a puff of smoke. Has to be rebuilt elsewhere. I'm not really sure about all of it. I mean, the reserve component bands that we have, just like our active component guys, get stuck with a lot of ceremonies. They end up standing someplace and playing for a governor or for some kind of a parade, the one thing or the other like that. So there aren't all that many opportunities that just come to them for a wide variety of things. That being said, they have leaders who've gotten pretty good at going to their bosses and say, "Boss, we've got this great idea. We want to do this kind of performance here and that kind of performance there." And as long as they have funds for their drills that they're doing, they can put that together and make it work. I think the biggest thing for them is there is some kind of a relationship there, in that many of their musicians they're not really concerned about playing at high professional levels. They've joined the reserve component band because they know the band leader, they know some people in the band. They used to play instruments in high school or college or whatever it is, and they would just like to continue doing that, and with the benefit of being paid for their performances. That's something that is not all that easy to deal with, particularly at their level, because if you're part of the Army, there's a sort of up or out principle going on there. You're expected to continue progressing in your leadership skills and your technical skills the whole time you're in there. So there are lots of stories about musicians and reserve component bands who get to a point where somebody's saying, "Okay, brand new Sergeant Edward, you now have to become an even better leader, and we're going to send you to this course that's going to do that." And there are a lot of those guys who say, "Well, no, I don't really have that. That's not really on my calendar." So they have to make a choice about whether they're going to continue along that path or leave their reserve component band. I think in some ways the community bands have a big advantage there. I mean, the people who come to perform in that community band can do that over a long period of time if they choose, or assuming that the band doesn't decide to ask them to do something else. So there's an opportunity there to get longevity in it. There's an opportunity to think about doing different things or doing innovative things over a longer period of time. There's no pressure to hatch some amazing new scheme for some different kind of performance and then put it out there right away. In the community bands, there's just a longer horizon there. It may not be that you want to be innovative. You may want to be guardians of the older styles, the more traditional styles of band music. And if so, that's fine. It's good that there are some people out there who do that, or some bands who do that. On the other hand, if you decide you want to be different, you want to do some other creative things, or maybe you just want to sprinkle a few different things into your programs, you're in a position where you can do that over a period of time without feeling pressured to do it. Oh, the history references I put out there. Right. I put out a Word document that's on your website now of history references in just some of the research that I and several other folks did. Thomas was one of them, on military music in America dating back to pre-Revolutionary War times. On that document, I put some stars beside references that I thought were really good and at least helped me get a better grip on how we came to the point that we are. One of the first ones in there is written by a retired CW4 named Raoul Camus. He commanded the 42nd Infantry Division Band in New York City for a long time, but he did a sterling job of describing how military music developed in the Revolution and took that all the way up to about pre-Civil War, sometime somewhere between the War of 1812 and the beginning of the Civil War. He described a lot of that. There's another one called 10 Years in the Ranks by Augustus Meyer. He joined the Army as a fifer, like vicinity of late 1830s, 1840s. But his book gives a really good picture of an Army school of practice for fifers, drummers, and buglers that operated at Governor's Island out there in New York for a long time. That school was operational right up until the end of the Civil War. There are several chapters in there that describe that school. Also describes his life as a military musician in the 6th Infantry Regiment. Here's a little bit that may interest you. In the British Army, it was traditional for a long time that the youngest musicians in the regiment were the people who were responsible for flogging soldiers who had committed heinous offenses. Believe it or not. Of course, once the British came to the United States, or came to what's now the United States, that tradition of keeping musicians being responsible for beating soldiers who had done something bad carried into our Army. So Augustus Meyer tells a story there of having seen this happen several times. And finally, some officer pointed to him and said, "Meyer, take this whip and whip that soldier for whatever I say he did." And Meyer said, "I'm not going to do that." And he repeated that a couple of times. He was court-martialed and put into a jail that the 6th Infantry Regiment had there. And he was sentenced for something like a year. But he was such a model soldier that it was hard for them to justify keeping him there. Plus, all the other soldiers in the regiment saw that. They saw him refuse to whip that other soldier. So they all, apparently, according to this story, would sneak food into the guy and, help him get through various parts of his incarceration. But I remember when I first read that about that kind of corporal punishment, I was just stunned that was actually part of the ritual there. The other one that I put out there was it's sort of a brief history of the Army's participation in the Navy School of Music. It does not have a good beat, and you cannot dance to it. But there are some little factoids in there that if you read the thing, you might be interested in seeing. It's sort of a timeline of bureaucracy doing what bureaucracies do. But the outcome in the end was at least a few steps forward from where they were. But it'll give you an idea of just how difficult it was to move from what the Navy was doing with training musicians around 1950 to what they're doing now that became active around 2012, 2013. And there was a lot of time in there doing things that most musicians just didn't want to do. And finally, kind of broke open a door there and went off on a different path. But I would commend those references to you if you have an interest in the history of military bands. There are a lot of hooks in there to what other academics have done. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. David Whitwell. He's a former Air Force musician, conducting teacher. He's a very dyed-in-the-wool music academician, but he has written some outstanding books on the development of string ensembles, development of brass ensembles. If you've read any of that other places, he has some really great explanations of the progress of instrumentalists from the old trumpet guilds in like the 16th and 17th century that were playing the hours from towers on the towers on the walls around cities. Explains how the old musicians guilds used to work when they had them. He has some great stories in there about the years when itinerant musicians moved around Europe a lot, the jongleurs and the troubadours and that kind of thing. There's some just fascinating things in there. But I'd recommend his stuff to you also if you're just interested in it. Band's about 45 years old, do 4 concerts a year. Our audiences range widely, but the bulk tends to be 30s, mid 40s, and up.
Mike Bell, fun fact, Dr. David Whitwell.
Yeah, Dr. David Whitwell. Do you know him?
Mike Bell, do we know him? You're muted.
He was before my time, but he conducted ACWE for a year.
I'll be there. How about that?
Or a fall. I think it was the fall.
Yeah, he had an ongoing Facebook thread for a long time. I followed that thing religiously just because he had such great information out there, and he had a good sense of humor. So it was easy to stay involved in that thread. But yeah, I mean, I've never met the guy, but just based on his readings, I think the world of his knowledge and his willingness to share it,
and his ability to make flute players cry.
Somehow that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, you know, the comment here about your audience as being 30s, mid 40s and up, that's actually kind of handy. I mean, if you're using the 30s and 40s as sort of the starting point of the age of your group, it's pretty easy to do that math, find out when they were in that 16 to 18 or 19 range, and then just, you know, use your own research skills. I mean, Rolling Stone is one source of top 40s. There are 2 or 3 other magazines that do that. There's a music research and music industry research group in Boston. I can't think of the name, Soundbeat or something like that. They do some really fascinating studies. They make you pay through the nose to see it. But their premise is they go out into the data on the music industry and look for every kind of expenditure that anybody makes on any kind of music. Then they break that down into the styles of music, and you kind of get the picture of which styles of music are surviving well and which are not. I mean, at that time, jazz was down there like next to the last and just sort of clinging, you know, to what little market share they had. And at that point, country music was eating everybody's lunch, you know, including the popular musicians. I think that's changed some over the years, but it's kind of interesting to see that kind of stuff, just to get the idea of, you know, what slice of the American public you're actually seeing the most of. That should be a big help in understanding what kinds of music will touch them. I'm not saying that you want to pander to every single thing they remember they heard, you know, at that age. Just saying that when you're looking for those tunes that will get to members of the audience, if you've got 2 or 3 of those that you can pull out at one time or another, you'll get the effect, you know, that research was trying to sell. Am I involved in community music currently? No, no, sadly not. And what do you devote your musical energies to currently? Mostly reading and history. I've had a fascination with history in general for as long as I can remember, and that includes music history. In the last maybe 20, 30 years, I've been trying to build the picture in my head of how ensembles developed, how the technology of the instruments changed over the centuries and how those things were grouped and put into ensembles and the composers who wrote for them and all that kind of business. So that's a part of it. It turns out too that along the way, I started getting an appreciation for other arts, painting and sculpture, for example. I couldn't paint or sculpt anything, but I like a lot of the things I see. So I do spend some time trying to understand some of the things that maybe I wouldn't understand otherwise. For me, though, I think the overarching thing is I'm just completely fascinated with how people learn, how they learn anything, a language, play an instrument, to read, all those kinds of things that go into the way we grow and develop as humans. So that's probably the bigger umbrella that all that stuff fits under is, how do we do that? What is it that happens in our minds and in our hands and the other tools we might use to be better at some of these things?
We're so quiet.
Your thought about what people listen to in their formative years made me start to think about the music we find in new movies and in games. Some of the music in gaming is really, really good music, and I wonder if that's going to be a genre that we see coming up in our community bands and just in general.
It certainly could be, and I totally agree with you. Gaming and movie scores. I was talking with somebody there at the school. I mean, there are two or three of us talking about where we thought a lot of this stuff was going to go. I remember telling them at the time, says some of it's already happened. I mean, some of the best music I can hear anywhere are in movie scores, and now even in TV scores. I don't know if you follow the British TV at all, but there's a detective series, one called Morse, about a detective by that last name. And there's another series about his younger years called Endeavor. But though the soundtrack in every one of those episodes is like a master class in choral, operatic, symphonic, and some chamber music. You never get the whole piece, but you get enough of it. You're thinking, oh yeah, I remember that, from somewhere. You think about the kinds of things that John Williams has done for movies and Star Wars and all that. I mean, that guy is, as far as I'm concerned, he's a giant. I had an opportunity to visit an immersive training seminar out in California some years ago, and part of that was to go visit Electronic Arts. We went in there to visit, and they took us up to the floor where they had their studios, where they had done some of the recording of their music for a while. There's nobody in there and nothing in the room. So with nobody in there and nothing in the room, how do you? So we don't record there anymore. So with the technology that's out there now, the people who do the music for us are basically recording tracks, and sometimes two or three of them are recording tracks of things on different instruments, and they mix those together into something that's different. Or there may be just one guy sitting behind a synthesizer or some other kind of digital technology that allows him to create the music that you're hearing in games now. I've never been a big gamer. I just kind of, every now and then I'll look into it, see if there's something in there that I can figure out. And the music in it is one of the things that always struck me. Is, you know, some of it is at the level of Mario Brothers, and some of it's at the level of John Williams and Mahler and Wagner and some of those guys. So there's a huge market there, I think, for that kind of thing. I do know that some of the Army bands, I want to say the field band actually had a package of music they did on some of their shows that came straight out of games. There was another one that came straight out of movies. So it's not something that people are ignoring. I think they just haven't quite figured out how to expand it.
Anybody have any follow-up questions to anything that Stan's talked about so far? I mean, I could pick his brain for days, but I don't want to be the only one talking.
No, after a couple of hours, you'd be done.
No, that's not true. Like I was telling on the phone when you gave us the, I think we had a 2 or 3 hour block when I was in ANOC. And I mean, the entire class was just fascinated. We didn't want it to end, but we were all kind of just dumbfounded by how much we realized we didn't know. You're a really good wealth of knowledge on about everything music related, mostly military, but I mean, it definitely is applicable to the rest of the industry.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
One of the things I was curious about is, you know, in your last, I don't know, probably 10 years of being training and doctrine, there was more emphasis on sound reinforcement. What are your thoughts about that with maybe like our band? Now, first, let me tell you, we do loud well. In fact, we have you know, where you see on a score maybe 3 or 4 Fs. Well, we just put ACWE. You know, ACWE loud. It's just what we do well because there's between 60 and 80 of us at any given rehearsal in a space that's meant for probably 40. And even when we're outside, you know, we can play louder and loudest really well. But there are occasions when we might have some sound reinforcements, say oboe, bassoon, or single clarinet, solo, in maybe one of our larger Catholic church venues. What are your thoughts on that? Is it necessary or something to look into?
You know, it's also circumstantial. You know, it's hard to call it necessary. If you have venues where you perform that work out well and you don't need, you know, like massive speakers and sophisticated mixing boards for all that, then why bother? For Army bands, I mean, we got into it because it was one of the things that we knew along the way needed to be done. Was we had bands going places, sometimes overseas, like in OIF and to Europe, trying to do popular music of one kind or another. They would take some speakers and maybe take a mixing board with them and get a product that was just not very good. And that's not us talking. That's what people in the field were telling us. So we started thinking then about creating a specialty for soldiers to acquire those skills, bring them back to the units, so that when they did need to use sound reinforcement and mixing boards and recording and all that kind of thing, there was at least one person in the unit who understood that task very well. We sent a master sergeant named Troy Haskell out to Disney in California for a year in a training with industry kind of an assignment. But Troy was already very well versed in sound reinforcement. But when he went to Disney, he also got an education in lighting, how that's done, how to arrange the the tools of sound reinforcement on a stage so that they're not so noticeable. They don't become like dominant, both orally and visually for an audience. A lot of that knowledge he brought back has been spreading now through a lot of the bands. I mean, there are still plenty of times where things don't work out well. Sometimes you just can't predict and control all the variables that make sound reinforcement work on your behalf. But the good news in my mind was that there's finally now a musician. Generally, he comes to the Army as a musician and then is trained further in sound reinforcement. So he's bringing a range of technical skills into the unit, and that's valuable. I mean, guys who can handle that well are the people who can look at whatever you're doing and say, we don't really need 6 speaker stacks out here. What we need is 2 this size, a small mixing board. I could control it from my iPad and it'll be enough for the size group we've got. People who can make those kinds of decisions as opposed to just assuming that what you need is something that is big, loud, and makes lots of bass sounds,
Well, if you don't have anything else for us, Stan, I think we went all around the world there, to Germany at least.
Got that far.
So I really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy guy. I sent you a few texts, but apparently that was to a 757 number, and I think you have a different one now.
Yeah, Florida 321.
Yeah, okay. I think I got it now.
Well, I got to tell you, I'm just honored and humbled that you asked me to meet with the group. I've just thoroughly enjoyed talking to folks here and getting the questions, and hope maybe I said something along the way that would be useful.